Welcome to the first interview for the Melbourne Review of Books. I'm Chris Johnstone, this is Jamie Ashbird, and tonight we're joined by the many talented Narrelle Harris.
Hello.
So,
shall we start?
Yes.
So we're here to talk about Improbable Press.
Yes.
Who, first off, can you tell us how it came about and what it is?
Improbable Press is a brand new imprint. It's a British press for Sherlock Holmes stories, but they're Sherlock Holmes stories filled with romance and erotica. There's many decades of reading the Sherlock Holmes-John Watson relationship as a romantic relationship, and an existing publisher of Sherlock Holmes fiction was speaking to a writer named Wendy Fries, who also writes under the name of Alan Merrick. And Wendy had just had a book published with this particular publisher. And then she floated the idea of saying, well, you know, it's the modern era. There are a lot of people really actually interested in the relationship and the friendship is more than a friendship. I think you probably have a readership beyond that. And he went, awesome, let's do that. So the press, Improbable Press, came about, and I'm sure you know where the name comes from. Perhaps you don't. One of the great Sherlock Holmes maxims is, once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Hence Improbable Press. So maybe many people think it's an impossible relationship, but you know, perhaps it's merely highly improbable. So there's three of us writing for the first publications now. So Wendy, writing as Alan Merrick, will have her first. She's writing the first two books actually, because she's powering on. So her first book was called The Day They Met, and that's Epic Best Friends meetings. She's now working on one called The Night They Met, which is first meetings but with a sexier overtone. Yes, and she's also doing a book called The Six Secret Loves of Sherlock Holmes, and they're not necessarily all romantic loves, but exploring those Greek ideas of different kinds of love. But they'll all be sort of revealed through, as I understand it, the eyes of John Watson. So the man who loves Sherlock Holmes, who is so often seen as a man of pure cold logic. But you know, I mean, you just have to read the canon stories, and you know that that's not the case. I've just been finishing reading the Naval Treaty, where he stops in the middle of an investigation to say how lovely flowers are, right? And everyone's going, "Don't we have a case too?" "Oh yes, case." You know, flowers, lovely. So through Watson's eyes, those stories, I understand that they explore the way Holmes is engaged emotionally with the world, and how those relationships and loves have made him the man that he is. Actually, I don't know offhand if those stories are set in canon era, the Victorian era, or are modern interpretations. And one of the things we're being clear on is that a modern interpretation is not necessarily a BBC Sherlock interpretation. The characters are all in public domain now, and there are many and multiple modern interpretations of the characters, including like the American Elementary series, but and there are other ways the characters are written about. So we can just have fun and do what we like and set them. So my first story for them is The Adventure of the Colonial Boy, and that I'm actually deliberately setting that in canon era. It's in 1893, set in Australia, because I thought that would be fun. And Australia is threaded throughout various short stories of the Arthur Conan Doyle canon, including the fact that John Watson clearly lived here in Ballarat for a short period, at least a short period, because he mentions knowing what the diggings of the Ballarat goldfields look like in one of the stories. So that's in The Sign of the Fall. He mentions the Sholto place, which has been dug up while the brothers look for the buried treasure, and Watson says, this looks like the Ballarat diggings. It's not mentioned when he lived here, but he's clearly Watson. Conan Doyle never did, but Watson obviously has.
Okay. That's a neat connection.
So it's quite a long answer to your question.
That's a good answer.
And I should say Verity Burns is the other one of the three writers, and she's doing a modern era story in which there is a murder at a country manor house, and when the detective shows up to find out who's the prime suspect, John Watson. I believe that's I mean, they're talking on behalf of the other guys there, but that's
So quite well-known authors in the Sherlock fanfic world.
Yeah. And all three of us are actually writers from other fields. So although we've been writing fanfic and playing with those ideas for a while, I'm a corporate writer. I'm also a fiction writer. I've had 6 books published, numerous short stories, fantasy, horror, romance and erotica. Wendy/Atlin has been a non-fiction and fiction writer for many years. So it's like we've kind of slid around it because we've found that there is a way to make a market out of something we enjoy writing about. But we're actually all professional writers that have come from other fields this way.
So how did you find your way into writing about Sherlock Holmes?
Well, I've been a Sherlock Holmes fan for about 30 years now. It was kind of funny. I didn't actually come in originally through the books. I had always, I'd read 1 or 2, I think, as a kid, but I'd often associated Sherlock Holmes with a lot of the films and stuff, particularly Basil Rathbone. But I disliked Nigel Bruce intensely. I thought a stupid Watson didn't make any sense, and often the Sherlocks were kind of avuncular and a bit friendly, smart, but just. There wasn't really anything sharp about him. I found the characters and their interactions quite boring. Often those Sherlocks treated their Watsons like a particularly favoured but dumb dog. I really disliked it. And then the Granada TV series came up in the late 80s with Jeremy Brett and then originally David Burke and then later Edward Hardwicke. And we thought, Sherlock Holmes, we'll give that a go. And it was like, it was like a bucket of ice water to the face, but in a really good way. Because you had all this, Holmes can be a difficult man. He's quite waspish and snappish. He can be very much a gentleman and very charming when he wants to be, but he's also like, he's a fractious genius, desperate to try and keep his mind active, which is why he's a cocaine user. I wouldn't say addict, but certainly a cocaine user in the books. So there was this really sharp, textured, edgy character, and his friend John Watson, who wasn't stupid. He was a sort of fairly, he was an intelligent guy, but very much a man of his time, and everyone looks a bit thick next to Holmes. But he had all these great qualities, and he was loyal, and he was kind, and actually quite interested in the bohemian lifestyle. So he wasn't as ordinary as he's often perceived to be, because he chooses this life to live with this guy and go off and help solve crimes, which is not what a man of his time would normally have chosen. And that took me back to the books. And then there's even more just wonderful texture in the stories. I've been really enjoying rereading them all, just in preparation for writing my book and trying to get an ear for writing of the era. I want to sound a little like the era without pastiching it, and that means doing a lot of reading for the cadences and the types of grammar and vocabulary that's used. And Watson is self-confessed bohemian. He's actually reading in the first book La Vie de Bohème by Henri Merger, from the 1830s, 1840s, I think, about the bohemian life in Paris. And he's often commented that he's, basically, Watson's not entirely right for polite society either, but in a different way. And then as you read the stories, you see that so often Watson is making deductions himself or suggesting theories. And it's so cute because you see Holmes in the books just smiling, obviously quite pleased. Oh, you're doing quite well, Watson. It's not correct, but you've been thinking hard. I appreciate that. And, often it'll be, yes, that was my idea. I had the same theory, but I disproved it already. But good on you for thinking on the same lines as me. Or, yes, you've deduced so far, but you've not got to the next step. But clearly from the short stories, Watson's not a stupid man. And it was just like, I fell in love then. How that then turns into writing Holmes and Watson. Like, so now I've been writing for a long time, doing different sorts of things. But in this particular case, a couple of years ago, I had a very nasty case of writer's block. And I loved the BBC Sherlock series. And then the second season ended. And I was like, this isn't good enough. There's only 3 episodes a season to start with. And now they've all gone off to do other films. there's not nearly enough Sherlock in my life. That's annoying. So I actually, because I knew there would be fanfic, I just Googled and I found out about this place called Archive of Our Own, and looked it up. And also I knew from experience, because as a teenager and then up into my early 20s, my first writing experiences were writing Blake Seven, sometimes Star Trek fanfic. So it was a really nurturing environment to become a writer, and actually, because you get feedback, you get little writing groups, you get people telling you what they liked, and you develop an understanding for writing character, for how plotting, for world building, particularly if you want to depart from the world that's shown. So it's a good training ground, I think. So yeah, I started reading stuff, and there was a particular site. There was an AO3, Archive of Our Own, gets called AO3, and there was another site that had prompts. And like I was stuck. I was having one of those couple of months where I think, I'm clearly just a shit writer. I clearly should just take up jigsaw puzzles, because like I'm crap at this. And just it's just my mojo's just gone. So I went to this site, and they would have like, I'd like to read a story where, and people would suggest something. So I looked at one once and went, that sounds like fun. And I bashed out 2,000 words in an hour and a half. But I went, okay, writing hasn't died. Just I'm having trouble. So for a while I would just write things in response to prompts, because it was fun, and there's a very lovely little effort reward turnaround, because you write, you put it there, somebody leaves comments, yay! So that's nice, but it was also, it can be really crippling sometimes, that whole, I've got to write this, and then I've got to edit it, and I've got to send it to someone. It's a really long process to get feedback. And there's also like, will this get published? And it has become something that was quite anxious for me to do. So to do this thing where I could just throw something down, get it out there, get response, and I promised myself I wouldn't like over edit. So, a lot of the stuff, there's errors and there's all sorts of, things going on there, but it was just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. And as it happens, I looked at AO3 the other day and my statistics, I'm very nearly up to 1 million words.
Oh goodness.
I'm going to have a party when I hit 1 million. But out of the work that I've done there, because I've experimented, I've tried writing, this is where writing romance and erotica came from, because I didn't used to write it. I used to think that it's very difficult to write good romance and certainly good erotica. It's very, very hard to do. So I started to experiment, because it was something I knew I wasn't comfortable doing. And it was, I felt like it was a safe environment to play with that idea and see how I could. So I read a lot. I worked out what I liked and didn't like and what I read with it. And did that. But I also, one of the prompts I responded to quite early on was a story, was somebody said, I would like a story in which John used to play guitar in a rock band as a teenager, and Sherlock finds out. And I thought, that would just be hilarious. But as a result of this, I wrote one story, and I thought, honestly, if I'm going to do this, John should play the guitar with Sherlock playing the violin. That would be fun. Yes. So I wrote a second story in which that happens, and then it kind of expanded. There's 106 stories in that series so far. But one.
So, sound for a few seconds. Now I just can't stop being silent because I've completely forgotten what I was going to ask.
It's not awkward at all.
No. I guess off the bat of talking about experimentation and crazy creativity, I would assume that Improbable Press wouldn't just, or would it, focus on the Holmes-Watson relationship, but any character from canon, or just
I don't know.
Whatever,
make a pitch, find out what they want.
Yeah.
So the press is still being officially set up now, as it is. But actually, my thoughts were also like, I could also, because I'm like equal opportunity sex for everybody. So I'd be quite happy to write an erotic novel with Watson and Mary Morstan. I think I'd quite like to play with a threesome. I haven't written one of those before. Let's make it polyamorous. Yay.
I'm sure you'd have
I'm sure there are many options. So I don't see why not. I mean, the impetus was the general and like I said, long-standing reading of queer subtext and making it text. But I don't see any reason why we should just basically have everyone having a good time. Yay! Yeah, I'm sure there are Irene Adler stories out there that she could be having fun.
Exactly. But the Holmes Watson relationship is the major one that
It certainly is.
because it's almost not subtext sometimes.
Well,
it's very loud
reading,
subtext.
yeah, and like I said, with reading canon again, there's like there's those discussions of modern interpretation of Victorian era behaviour, but you also remember that the same labels weren't used at the time, and of course, men having sexual relationships with other men was illegal. The death penalty for it, I think, ceased in about 1861, but you could still be flogged and imprisoned. And obviously, this is what happened to Oscar Wilde, whom Arthur Conan Doyle knew. So, one of the things I've said to people is, if you read Conan Doyle's stories and say, well, obviously they're not gay, he didn't write them as gay. So, well, he wouldn't, would he? Because he lived in an era where that was not acceptable, where the punishment for being for the indecency of it was very harsh and horrible. And so, of course, there would be gay men who didn't use that label for themselves. And, you know, there's all sorts of essays around about, you know, whether or not even, you know, being called gay is more of a cultural construct. And, you know, I'm not well-versed enough to talk about that. But, you know, you can't look at that and just dismiss it because, well, he wouldn't have and people didn't. So, well, people did, right? Absolutely they did. But they had to be either really, really discreet or they suffered the consequences. So there are plenty of things like there is actually a website out there called, I think it's called With Love SH, and it goes through and does analyses of queer readings of Conan Doyle's texts, including one, The Resident Patient. I was just reading about that one, and it points out that Holmes goes to Watson's room to wake him up because they've been called out to Brook Street because tragedy has struck. But it's not the first time he's popped up in Watson's room, but he shows up in Watson's room in nothing but his night shirt and his robe, and that might have been considered quite, they must know each other quite well. For a man to go in another man's room in his pyjamas, and they'll say, you know, actually in this era this would be quite an uncommon thing. That's potentially a reading of them as being having a much more intimate relationship than perhaps, you know. And I was just rereading the Naval Treaty the other day, and it's just, there's this little bit, you can kind of read the end of that story where Holmes is a bit unnecessarily cruel to, I don't know how familiar you are with the story, but a naval treaty gets stolen, the fellow it's stolen from basically gets brain fever. He gets brain fever for 9 weeks and is sort of in a delirium, and when he recovers sufficiently, they engage Holmes to try and find this terribly important document. Which turns out to have been hidden in the sick room. Sorry, spoiler. It turns out to be hidden in the sick room the whole time, which is why, you know, the guy who stole it was actually the brother of Percy Phelps's fiancée. And so he's been a nervous wreck, and Watson, under Holmes's instructions, takes Phelps back to Baker Street and proceeds to just totally get on Watson's tits. Like, he's just whining and moaning. I know you haven't been well, but for God's sake, just you know, chill, dude, chill. And the guy's going, oh, do you think you could really help me? And oh, it's much more difficult than anything he's had to do before. And Watson's going, no, this is pretty low down. Yeah, he's done much more difficult things. And so the whole thing is, Phelps is going, and Watson's just going, don't diss my Holmes. He's gonna get this sorted. Right, and it's just, and you know, obviously that could just be read as this very warm, solid, loyal friendship. But Holmes's choice to do ta-da, and it actually reveals the naval treaty under a breakfast dish, nearly giving Percy Phelps another coronary. Like, he nearly has another nervous collapse as a result. I can't help reading that just a little bit, as he's a bit, Percy Phelps was John Watson's old school friend, a little bit fey, a little bit less, he's a little bit pale and interesting just at the moment. Kind of, there's something about it that smacks a little bit of, I'm a little bit jealous of my Watson. I'm just going to show how awesome I am. I'm going to show off to my boy. And it just feels a little bit like he's peacocking a bit for Watson. And Watson just going, my man, right? So it's just there's all this just this little subtext of how Holmes shows off for Watson sometimes, and the pair of them troll each other mercilessly, even in canon and stuff. So
I mean, I'm not a Arthur Conan Doyle scholar or anything, but he was an interesting person. He had sort of interesting out there ideas. I mean, as a spiritualism, but then other ideas as well. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that he may have been sneaking things in, which is an interesting idea.
indeed, and I mean, who can know? And I mean, I know as a writer myself, sometimes people tell me the things I put in my books that I didn't know I put there. But you know that. Reading and writing, it's the two together are a really interesting part of the creative process, because I know myself, I take things out of books that perhaps the author didn't deliberately put there, but I'm bringing my own experience, so there's an alchemy that happens, that I interpret things through what I've already been through and how I've seen the world. So there's, you can't negate somebody's experience, whether or not you chose to put that there. Their experience will bring that out. And of course there's a subconscious mind goes and does all sorts of things on you at times as well. So there's but yeah, he certainly would have been aware of I imagine of men who liked men, loved men. And he was a very forward-thinking man. Part of my research for The Adventure of the Colonial Boy is that I wanted to find out how good a doctor John Watson was, because in the books you tend to think of him as just giving brandy to people all the time. But the thing to remember is that 19th century medicine, germ theory actually only came to be accepted in about 1876. It was debated before then and started to be proven. So in terms of the chronology of John Watson, at the time he started medical school, people still thought it was miasmas and humours that made people sick. And there was massive debate in the medical fraternity about whether tiny little animals under a microscope make people sick. Don't be stupid. And I was reading a surgeon would wear his bloody, gruesome apron with pride because it demonstrated his experience. Didn't seem to occur to him that they were poisoning next patient. They didn't wash their hands between patients. So there were people like Dr. Joseph Lister and Koch who did the work on tuberculosis, and I've forgotten the third, Pasteur. And they were doing these arguments, and it was Lister who said you should use carbolic spray, you should use carbolic bandages, and sure enough, in one of the books, The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb, a guy comes to Watson's surgery next to Paddington Station. He's had his thumb severed by a machete. What does Watson do? He uses a carbolic bandage to put on it. So he's actually, as much as we're aware that Holmes is a user of modern technology in that Victorian context of telegrams and telephones and all this sorts of stuff, Watson's actually also a man who's reading ahead of the wave. So he was actually at the forefront of medical technology as it existed in the Victorian era, from my understanding of the reading. It's been fascinating. I bored my doctor stupid the other day. I had to go in for a checkup, and I'm going, germ theory, that's so awesome. He's going, yes. I'm like, yeah, but I know, but germ theory is so cool. And the lives that suddenly got saved because they realised that, and then antibiotics didn't come till the 20th century. So, yeah.
No, even just washing hands and boiling things made a radical difference.
So, I'm all for Watson the man.
He was also a military doctor, and that's the military was usually the forefront of medicine because, well, it's on the field. It's right there, right now.
Yeah.
It's first aid. And
it was pretty gruesome out in Afghanistan. Still is.
It's
kind of
changed.
Kind of sad.
No.
It's rough. It's rough.
Yes, yeah.
It's no wonder, though, when you read, there are stories where Watson's basically saying, my practice is rather dull. Basically, any opportunity he has to drop his practice on the locum and take off after Sherlock Holmes, he must have been so bored in general practice after stitching people up in the army.
It doesn't like he'd be an inconvenient GP to have. You've got a flu and you go along to your doctor and it's like, no, he's off solving murders.
Oh, see, I suspect the people went to Dr. Watson, not because they were ill, but because it was the Sherlock Holmes Dr. Watson, and they. If you were actually sick, you'd go to somebody who was there.
Right.
But there's also the theory that in one of the stories, Watson's wife calls him James instead of John, and this is where the idea that his middle name is Hamish, which is the Scottish for James, because we knew his initial was H. And I mean, the actual factual reason is that Arthur Conan Doyle gave less than no shits about continuity, right? He had no damns to give about that at all. But, you know, it's always fun to make up the thing there. But somebody else has suggested that James is the name of the locum she was having an affair with. Because John was never home. So,
yes. James, I mean John.
Yes. Oh, you, guy with a moustache. You off again. Go off with your little friend.
I mean, there's an interesting point there, of course, which is that although Holmes and Watson have gone on to be much beloved and have, in fact, got quite a lot of staying power, I mean, Conan Doyle himself really hated the characters by the end. Those continuity.
If he was alive today, he'd be up trolling all the websites.
Oh yeah,
he would totally would, because he wanted his serious historical work to be taken seriously.
Have you ever tried to read The White Company?
I haven't.
I have.
Any good?
I know I couldn't make it through it
because he's writing in the home stories. He's often really so evocative and
lucid and vivid. Yeah.
The way he paints landscapes is just so amazing.
Yeah. So the White Company is written in the style of the Waverley novels. In the style of the Scottish author whose name is completely gone out of my head.
Is that the one I think? Or is that a suburb?
There's a great big statue in Edinburgh, which is worth visiting.
That guy, the dude.
That guy.
Hashtag we'll look this up later, little asterisk.
But him I find very readable. Conan Doyle's attempt to be him, not so much.
Yeah, maybe that was the problem. Maybe he was trying too hard to be
someone else.
Someone else, rather, because his own. I mean, he's really good. And you look at the Professor Challenger books and stuff as well, and some of his other ghost stories and horror stories. He has such a gift for that, and I think it's a shame that he wanted to be a writer of stuff that wasn't where his gift was.
Have you read the one where the people hold a seance and they summon a unicorn?
No, I've got to look that one up. That's awesome.
I have a copy of it. The unicorn is murderous. It kills one of them. Well, they only sort of know they summoned it. There's kind of a sense of a unicorn afterwards, and one of them is dead with a hole through his chest. It's actually quite an eerie, quite well written story. It's obviously not in the Holmes Watson canon, but no, he wrote some actually lovely little twisted little ghost stories and things as well, which worth hunting up.
I'll have to find that unicorn.
Yeah, he was just a very evocative writer and a really good sense of developing a brooding sense of place.
Yes.
And also sometimes a very positive, sunny sense of place. He was just really good at anthropomorphizing landscapes and imbuing them with personality, I think, which worked really, really well.
I was going to talk about miasma because I love the poison belt.
Right. Well, we're going to come back by saying Walter Scott, the most famous of Scottish authors we couldn't remember a moment ago. And miasma.
Miasma. It's a great word.
Miasma. It is. It is a lovely word. Also, of course, malaria, a bad air, which shows how it's.
I love etymology.
Good old influenza.
It's really fascinating. Sometimes, if you have a little bit of an understanding of etymology, it can help you remember how to spell words.
Oh yes, it's
very cool.
It comes in handy knowing Greek too.
Yes, yes. Many English words involved. Actually, no, I don't really know Latin so much. But yes, we're getting off. We're kind of derailing here a little.
Yes.
We're derailing on something. I don't have any more questions. I've run out. What's your favourite home story?
Yes.
It's there are different things I like about different stories. But one of the stories I've always found really creepy is The Speckled Band. It's so well written that sense of creeping horror. So that's and the whole and Grimsby Roylott, like he's such a. There was always this lovely fine line about how grotesque the characters could be, and with the Granada series, because I've been reading the home stories aloud to Tim at the moment, and of course it makes you think, I want to go and watch the Jeremy Brett episodes again, because they did a beautiful job of casting characters. To be almost that Dickensian bit of grotesqueness, but just pulled back enough that they do have to be larger than life. One of the reasons the Elementary series I stopped watching that is I actually love Lucy Lewis as Dr. Watson. I really like the relationship with her homes and the kind of homes that that he was. But the mysteries are any old CSI police mystery, and the whole, for me, one of the big things about Sherlock Holmes is they ought to be a bit bizarre and a bit outré, a bit grotesque in that very Victorian use of the word grotesque, you know. So one of the other stories I really, really enjoy, just because it's so grotesque in that sense, is the Copper Beeches. And in the Granada episode, the father in the household is played by an actor named Joss Ackland, I think was his name. So he's a very big, square, heavy guy. Because in the story, this young governess is hired to look after the little boy in the household, but she's asked to cut her beautiful hair and to occasionally wear an electric blue dress. So I'm laughing because my husband and I are always going, you know, she's at this job interview and this guy's like, oh, you wouldn't mind if we get you to cut your hair or wear a particular dress, just sit somewhere. Oh, we're fatty people. It's like, yeah, fatty people means run for your life, right? It's very creepy, the whole thing. You kind of almost expect them to be going home and for him to wait for the governess and his wife to start having sex together while he sits in the background and plays music. It's just so weird. But yeah, like, it's this utterly grotesque because he seems quite a friendly, affable person, and then suddenly becomes this really menacing, dangerous man, and they're asking her to do quite odd things which aren't quite, they don't seem improper, but they're not quite proper either. And so there's this really weird sense of menace, but it's all done with this affable exterior until this point where he catches her going into the closed off wing where his actual daughter is being held prisoner because he doesn't want her to get married, wants to keep the money. More spoilers, sorry. So spoilers for things that are, well, stories that are 120 years old. But you know, I shouldn't really, because there are still people reading those stories for the first time.
That's true.
You know, so it's still a spoiler for them. I'm so sorry. But yeah, he catches the governess, and he's all affable and saying, "Oh well, you know, the reason this is locked is that it's private, and you shouldn't be. It's all right, my dear. I didn't mean to frighten you, but don't come in here again, or I will throw you to the mastiff." And it's this huge dog they only feed a tiny amount once a day and have it roaming the grounds. It's really like he suddenly drops into this absolutely terrifying threat. And you suddenly go, okay, all the creepy feeling I've been getting, you should have listened to your creepy feeling and run for the hills. So I like that story too, just because the horror effect of it is really intense and very well done.
It's a very fine, very deft touch putting that in. Is it something you feel you've been able to put into your own home's work?
I'm hoping so. I'm working on it. It'll be one of those things because I'm still on the first draft. So obviously there will be tweaking and playing, and I'm hoping to get to that because my first chapter, I don't think this is a spoiler, it's still the first chapter, but Watson thinks that Holmes is dead. But in the story, somebody has found out, one of their enemies has found out that Holmes is not in fact dead, and has essentially said, well, we can still get our revenge, we'll kill his little doctor friend. So Watson is going around a bit oblivious, he's in grief, his wife has died in childbirth, and he's just finished writing all these stories about his dead friend whom he loves but has never been able to admit that. Hardly to himself, certainly never to anybody else. And so he's delivering the last of the stories to the Strand magazine, and in the course of a day he's nearly killed 3 times. And so I'm hoping to get a bit of that sense of, but Watson's just a little bit of oblivious because he's just kind of preoccupied with his grief, so he doesn't notice that somebody's almost thrown him and pushed him in front of a train or tried to run him down with a carriage. And then there's a venomous adder at the cemetery where he goes to see his wife, and he's going, this is a really annoying day, I'm having a very bad time. So that's because people are trying to kill each other. But I'm trying to get some of that sense of the creepiness and so yeah, I guess I won't know how successful I am until I'm published and I hear from people. But I did read my first chapter out to my husband because I wanted to feel if I was getting a sense of that tone, and he thought it was. He's biased, but it doesn't mean it's wrong.
It is sort of in that sphere of writing that feels like it ought to be read aloud.
And it reads aloud beautifully.
For those listening at
lockers in
home,
there.
we have a security guard outside struggling with the door. He seems okay now, I'm not sure.
Close down, Will.
I
Shake
just-
your fist at the sky.
I guess I had a similar question, which is, what is your favourite Holmesian story that wasn't written by Arthur Conan Doyle? So, of what you've read, I suppose, you know, your own work experience, as brilliant as it is.
One of the things I've found is so a bit of a chat going on.
Yes.
Talk amongst yourselves. We'll be back with you soon. I actually really enjoyed. I'm trying to remember his name. Nicholas. The 7% Solution.
Okay.
Which I thought was really interesting. Where Sigmund Freud is a character in that, and that was always kind of interesting. Film-wise, I've actually just really enjoyed. I quite enjoyed Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother about Mycroft. Gene Wilder. I think it's been a long time since I saw it. So that was kind of fun. And obviously, I really enjoyed the BBC Sherlock. I think it's quite flawed in some ways, but you know, there's they capture one of the joys of watching BBC Sherlock and rereading canon is to see how much of the stuff that you think they made up for the show, which has actually come straight from the books. Like the episode where Sherlock shows up covered in blood and holding a spear, and just go, well, that was tedious.
Right.
And it's actually from a story called The Adventure of Black Peter, where he's come home, going, well, I've spent the morning down at the butcher's in Spitalfields trying to harpoon a pig carcass.
Right.
And then I had to walk home because no hansom cab would take me. And you go, well, look at you. But it's direct from canon, so it's quite entertaining. So I enjoy seeing that interpretation because of all the echoes from the original, how it plays with those ideas and stuff. In fan fiction, I think Wendy's a fantastic writer, and I've really, really loved her stuff. But there's some good writers out there. There's this public opinion or this idea that fanfic is necessarily poorly written, and it's just that tends to be a self-affirming diagnosis because people will then go and look for the badly written stuff. But there are really good stories and by very good writers, really complex plotting, and one of the things that's great about fanfic is that you'll tend to get writers writing from a non-mainstream point of view. One of the best and most interesting short pieces of fanfic was that is writing Sherlock as a transgender, or in fact an intersex character, because he's so often seen as being asexual, but there are other interpretations. And the story was written by somebody who is themselves intersex, so they're writing direct from their experience, and I learned so much reading that. It was a beautifully written story. And talks about that Sherlock's sexual experience of his body and how that relates to John and how John is respectful and caring. So it's kind of like this door that the mainstream doesn't look at. And you know, I'm so much more aware these days of how the transgender character is the punchline or the joke, and it's hurtful and it's offensive, and you know, and I have. The more I see it, the more I think it shouldn't be. And that's one thing that Elementary did right, is their Mrs. Hudson is a transgender character. Which is, you know, but she's just... She's not the butt of a joke. She's not there to make some cruel and obnoxious point. And, you know, and so you get a lot of that in the fanfic. You get people who are neurodiverse or all kinds of approaches to life which are departed from the mainstream, and you can learn a lot about people because these are people who don't see themselves in stories anywhere in the mainstream, so they're writing stories with characters that they love for themselves, in which their experience is reflected in the world. And I think it's a really, really positive thing.
Well, in fact, there's a large body of people who are excellent writers, who are very competent, who are simply writing perhaps with a focus on an area which would see them having difficulty getting it through the mainstream presses. And as much as, in the one hand, it's unfortunate that isn't going through commercial press, on the other hand, it's fortunate that there is a way for that to reach an audience, and that's...
And it's not, I mean, it's slow, but it builds up. There's a lot of TV shows with transgender characters in I mean, I watched Hit and Miss recently, which is an interesting little show about an assassin with Chloe Sevigny as the character. But there's transparent. You're much more likely to see transgendered characters who are not there to be an obnoxious and awful joke. I remember some years ago when Mrs. Doubtfire came up, sort of looking at a slightly thing. The only happy, stable, got it together couple with a gay couple.
Right.
And all the heteros were just like a mess.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, obviously one film doesn't, you know, it's not changing society and stuff, but you start to see more diverse experience and more positive representation of. We've been watching Mr. Selfridge, and we were very disappointed with the second season, partly because one of the characters is an evil queen of the old school, like from 70s TV shows. He's a mincing bastard going around, but he's just such an old trope, archetype, evil queen going around just being terrible. Oh, man.
All right, welcome back.
Technology, it's wonderful.
So we were on fan fiction before.
We keep rolling around. It's very circular.
And discussing some of your favourite fan fiction. One thing I was going to say, of course, is that an unacknowledged thing, and this was, of course, prior to fan fiction being a thing that could be put online, was that many writers start as fan fiction writers. I mean, a huge number of very well-known writers, that's where they started, just writing their own whatever.
You fall in love with the world and you think there's not enough of it, so you write some more. Basically, somebody has pointed that Shakespeare wrote fanfic.
Oh, yes. No, absolutely.
Actually, you did ask me before, and I've just remembered one of my favourite Holmes and Watson short story alternative ideas was Neil Gaiman.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name of the story, but the one that's a Sherlock Holmes Cthulhu crossover. Yes, and it's fabulous. It's a fabulous story. So I wrote an article for the Queensland Writers' Centre's magazine about fanfic and professional writers who write fanfic and some of the attitudes towards it. But sometimes if you do fanfic and then it gets professionally published, is it suddenly no longer fanfic?
Yes, no.
I know that there tends to be this idea of the quality. It's the same kind of divide there is between. Have you guys ever heard of something called filk music?
Yes, I've heard of it. I don't think I've ever attended any filking.
Oh, I did some at the last science fiction convention. But for those not in the know, filk music comes from a typographical error for folk music. And it's folk music for science fiction and fantasy fans. So people might write a song about a Terry Pratchett book. In fact, Terry Pratchett's books are full of music and little songs, like A Wizard's Staff Has a Knob at the end. Is that literature or is it a folk song? And of course, you get the musicians who have set it to music and sing it. So there's this bit of a discussion and debate. But yet you have Queen doing a song called 39, which is actually all about space travel. Well, it's a professional band. It's not called folk music, but it's of that same tradition. It's just at the far end with better production values. So there's these interesting discussions. So essentially, it's like, something's folk music or it's fanfic if the writer or the musician deems it to be such. But there's a lot of people who start, like, as we said, Shakespeare took off older stories to turn them into things like Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet and Hamlet and things that they get called. So people get inspired by other things and then work with the same characters and do things. It's a long-standing tradition, but it's
I mean, another grand tradition in writing is to take another character and sort of rub the serial numbers off and rename them and put them through your story. And such things can actually work quite well. I mean, it's similar. What you're getting at there with the quality divide, of course, is similar to some of the genre things that go on. That it's sort of literary or magic realist if it's of a certain quality, and if it's not of a certain quality, then it becomes fantasy. And it's one of the sort of weird things that you.
They're quite artificial divides, but you also look at things like. I have a particular bugbear, I suppose, about I've occasionally read things or recently seen things where they're taking science fiction, fantasy or horror tropes, but they're being written or produced by people who aren't from that background, which, may end up with a reasonable story, but for me, as somebody who's more familiar with those backgrounds, usually ends up with something that makes me angry, bored and depressed. So P.D. James's Children of Men is one of the few times that I've ever found a film to be so much superior to the book, because the book I felt was written by somebody who didn't really understand those apocalypse tropes.
Right.
And I found some of what she wrote in her original story to be like quite offensive in its quite simplistic approach to it. But the film was made by people who understood the genre, and the film's fantastic. The book made me angry. And I've been having this interesting discussion recently. This may be spoilerific, so you might want to. I'll try not to say anything that's a giveaway. But we've just watched the 6 episodes of Glitch from the ABC, which are all on catch up. But I think at this point, only 2 of the episodes have actually been screened.
Yes.
But I got to the end of it, and I kept waiting for the modern era plot to develop.
Right.
And we got tiny little flecks.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me that giving us a character's backstory was what substituted for advancing a modern day plot.
Yes.
And it's like, no, that's just the backstory.
Yeah.
Why are these people, for anybody who doesn't know, it's a not quite a zombie series, but a group of dead people this isn't a spoiler, happened in the first 5 minutes. They crawl out of their graves, and we don't know why they're alive. They're not zombies, they're returned to life. We don't know what's going on. So somebody who reads that genre, I was expecting, I didn't need to have all the answers at once, but I expected some of the answers, and I got to the end of it, and I was just like, that's 6 hours of my life I'm never getting back. I was really cross about it. I was so angry about it, I posted on Facebook. Well, that was a waste of time. I'm so disappointed because I expected so much, and I really enjoyed the first couple of episodes. The acting's fine, the setting's fine. There's so much about it that's good, but it just feels like something was made by people who don't know the tropes. That they've done it as a soap opera about dead people. Yeah. I don't care about it. Like, love triangle bores me, and because you're taking really obvious approaches to that. I could predict what was going on, and things that should have been a shocking revelation, we'd seen them coming, and they'd actually shown us a sequence where a particular event had happened. So, like, it's hardly surprising when the other characters find out about it. And so, for me personally, I found it really poorly paced, and I expected a bit more meat, and not just the smell of it, as it were. That's kind of a grotesque sort of analogy given the subject matter. But there are other people who absolutely love it. So
may I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 25 minutes. I repeat.
The joys of live recording.
This is a man who's very aware that I could probably talk at least that long.
Incidentally, those watching the interview, we're not in the library. We have a speaker apparently that connects us to the library, but we were able to learn that the library is now closing in 25 minutes.
And that's a comfort to me.
I'm pleased.
But anyway, so you may not want to keep that bit in, but there was actually
I don't know.
There were some people who were saying that they felt that that I was being a bit harsh. And I go, well, it's just my opinion, and I'm exploring why I had the reaction. My reaction is my reaction. I'm just trying to explore for myself and explain. Because you can't tell me I wasn't disappointed just because you weren't. I was disappointed. But so I find that a little bit frustrating with certain things. So, like, sort of going back, there was an original point we were talking about, which is how quality determines what something's, how something is seen. But that is a really subjective thing, because perhaps one of the people who took me to task over saying that I didn't like it was going, well, I liked it. I don't watch science fiction and horror and fantasy, and I thought it was fantastic. And I thought, this may be why you liked it. But then other people I know who do enjoy the genre fiction and write the genre fiction that I write also liked it. So they were just getting something out of it. They just passed me by. So
Or is it I don't know if you've seen, is it the French series Revenant?
I knew of Revenant, and also I think it was The Resurrected. There was an American done with the same idea. And this Australian one, I understand that it was in development before those other series were made, so it's not a copycat. It's just, it's one of those, it's kind of like a natural offspring of the zombie trope. And because the last great zombie series that I really, really enjoyed, I've only seen the first season of, is a British series called In the Flesh. And it is actually post-zombie apocalypse. And they've discovered that it was a virus. survivors have to take medicine every day, and they've still got weird eyes, and they're really pale, and they're kind of they have some new politically correct name, like the recently reanimated dead, the RRD, something like that. But it's actually it's really, really well done, and it's I loved that one because it took those tropes and those genre ideas that we're familiar with, and then took it somewhere new.
Yeah, no, it's a long-standing problem of someone coming to a genre that they don't really understand. I mean, actually, this relates a little bit, of course, you earlier mentioning that romance is very hard to write in, that there are a lot of people who either have never written a novel, or people who have written novels who look at romance and think, I would like a piece of that money, and they go and try and write a romance novel, and it's terrible. But they don't know it's terrible because they've never read it.
I think you have to be dedicated to believe it. You have to
want
to write a big romantic and want to write romance. There's also, this could be a whole other subject, and there are other people who've written on it who know more than I do, but there's actually interesting explorations about whether or not the disparagement of romance is an offshoot of misogyny. Because if there are stories written about relationships which are seen as women's kind of territory, then often, women writing about that. But Shakespeare wrote romances constantly. P.G. Wodehouse wrote very funny romances. When male writers, The Rosie Project, that's a romance novel. And it's a romance novel with a bit of perhaps an unusual viewpoint. But those unusual viewpoints happen in a lot of different romance novels, maybe not quite the same way. But people tend to think romance, Mills and Boon, this kind of thing. It's actually a really broad genre, like science fiction is a really broad genre, and horror. There's a lot of different stuff being written about. But I sometimes think, because Rosie Project was written by a guy, it's not immediately dismissed. So they looked at the story instead of looking at the genre to discuss it. And then I just got cross. So I actually turned from someone who never, I didn't really read a lot of romance. The stuff I read I wasn't really enjoying. And I just put the call out on Twitter once and go, obviously I'm not reading the right stuff. There are people I know who really like this, who I know are feminists, really, smart, clever, intelligent, funny women. What am I missing? And they said, read Anne Gracie. And I was like, that was fantastic. She was converted me to romance. But I don't like all science fiction. I don't like all horror. Not all writers and all genres are all good. You've got to employ Sturgeon's law and the corollary to Sturgeon's law. Sturgeon's law is 95% of everything is crap. So clearly the corollary is 5% of everything is good or better. So it's, you just got to look for the 5% in whatever genre that you're reading.
Actually, on that point, we could probably wrap up and all right. Well, thanks. Thank you, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us. This is of course the first of our interviews. Hopefully we'll be interviewing some more Melbourne writers, and it's Narrelle Harris. You already have some novels out, and of course, if you remind us quickly, it was
so my next book will be coming out next year is The Adventure of the Colonial Boy. If you'd like to find out more about my work and my other books and what's going on with this one, if you go to my blog, which is www.mortalwords.com or .com.au, I have both domains. You will find me, but if you just search for Narrelle M. Harris, Narrelle with a double R, I'm sure you'll find me. I'm all over the place. I'm all over the internet like a rash.
In a good way.
It's
one of those rashes you want.
Yes, and Improbable Press is on Facebook. If you just want to look up Improbable Press, and we actually do a lot of discussion about. I blog up there about my reading of canon. We put links to interesting things like household poisons that are available in case you're planning to kill someone. Things that Sherlock Holmes might know.
Handy things.
Yeah, useful things.
No, and there are. We'll end on household poisons and how to kill people. Seems appropriate.
I don't know how to stop.